All right, have a seat. So we have with us, we have Clifton. He just finished his freshman year at Howard. Congratulations, man, congratulations.
Yay.
Thank you.
And we have Keish, who just finished her collegiate career at Syracuse, so just graduated. And we also have Amanda, who also just graduated, so congratulations to you. Amanda made a video that we want to use to sort of kickstart our discussion here. So, well, we're going to use that to kickstart our discussion here.
It's a strange thing to feel invisible. Not in the metaphorical Ralph Ellison way, but to actually walk around campus knowing that people have this sharpened ability to look right through you. It's feeling and knowing that people have the convenience of ignoring the complexity of your identities. And oddly enough, the moment in which you don't feel quite invisible is when the group of fraternity guys drives by in their truck on a Saturday night yelling, "Roll Tide, nigger," or when a mysterious hand writes fag in aching black letters across the door to your room. But it's those moments in which you shrug and you think, well, at least they saw me.
The black body is a dark phantasm in the American consciousness. It has been depicted as both superhuman and childlike, both hypersexual and asexual, both nefariously cunning and rife with dull, brutish ignorance. It inhabits both the American public's most dreaded nightmares and their most fantastic dreams. It is everywhere and nowhere at the same time, hypervisible in moments of condemnation and scapegoating, and utterly invisible when that same dark body voices concern for its own physical safety or the denial of its supposedly inalienable rights. I go to class in buildings that are named after white supremacists, eugenicists, and slave owners. I live in a place where, after President Obama was reelected, my parents warned me to stay in my dorm room after I told them that white students were attacking black students and kicking down their doors. I spent the past 4 years in an environment that not only condones the Confederacy and its flag, but also praises it as a symbol of Southern heritage. It is not my heritage. I am surrounded by people who may not have to call me a nigger, but they make it clear to me just the same.
The history of our university is a testament to the need for cultural change and how it should transcend across the state. Like any freshman, eager to explore the social aspect of college and savor the endless freedom from responsibilities, I attended my first frat party. From the outside, it was like any other, but as I walked inside, my perception immediately changed. The atmosphere was cold, and the facial expressions of those around me was everything but inviting. I was the only person of color in the room, and the decoration of Confederate flags wasn't exactly comforting. However, a familiar face in the fraternity made me feel at ease. We began to talk, and I was introduced to many of the people at the party. From the corner of my eye, I saw a particular person stumbling toward us. Drunkenly, he uttered, "Hey, who's the nigger?" Moments like these have a profound impact on our character. I chose to be proactive and run, not away from the institutionalized divide, but into a position of influence that would allow me to change culture. As SGA president, I thought I would have the opportunity to begin a changing tide, but still, I'm asked, who's the nigger?
All right, so I thought that video was a very powerful way to begin this discussion on protest, race, and free speech on college campuses. So I want to begin with a question that was posed in the video, actually. So let's start with Amanda. Do you feel like a problem?
I definitely have felt like a problem on my college campus. As young black people, we're often sold the idea that higher education is your ticket out, it's your way to a better life, to gain financial security and gain social capital. But when we come to campuses, we're often straddled by student debt, we're taught by people who don't look like us or don't understand our experiences, and we're often faced with these conditions that make us feel like we can't be seen or can't be heard, or that our ideas don't have value either in our communities or in the academic canon. So definitely yes.
All right, anybody want to follow up? Keish?
Definitely so. I think what Amanda just said rings truth to me as well. As an undocumented student who's getting a private funding and a grant from Syracuse University, and making that very public or known in campuses and in classrooms had been, I've been received through like violent, visceral reactions, right? And people become uncomfortable, and it really does, I do question like what it means to be like a undocumented woman of color studying at a private university and saying the kind of things and asking for certain things. And I think I am posing a problem, but it's a good kind of problem, right? A good kind of threat that we're posing.
Yeah, I think I like to say I'm a problem. Problems bring about solutions, right? And as a Ferguson protester, and then coming to Howard as a freshman, you know, trying to get students engaged in the broader struggle, whether that be, you know, police brutality, the criminal justice reform, and you know, the issues that affected the community outside of Howard, and even the issues inside of the school. So really trying to balance the two. You know, I have faced friction, but I've also, you know, had allies and co-conspirators who've come aboard to help us engage in the work and get things done. So, yeah, it's a good problem. I'm a good problem.
One of the things that we sort of discussed backstage, and it's an assumption that I actually had not explored, was exactly what free speech actually means to students. So let's lead off with you, Clifton. What does free speech mean to you in your work as a protester and in your work and in your student life?
Mm-hmm. So what does free speech mean to me? Free speech is my ability to engage in student activism. And I like to be careful when I use the term student movement, because when we use the term student movement, we tend to center students as a self-interest class or whatever. And like, I try really hard to really connect students to the broader struggle and trying to get as many students as possible in large numbers engaged in the issues that face us, whether that be, you know, police brutality and looking at the state and local federal budgets and, you know, how communities are resourced and that sort of thing. And free speech also means, you know, our ability to protest and fight for these ideas without hindering on anyone else's freedoms. So yeah. So
does that mean to you that when those freedoms sort of clash, is there some way one side curtails the others? How do you deal with that intersection of different people's rights?
So like what we have to understand is that a huge problem is that, like in Ferguson, you know, certain communities couldn't understand why we were protesting at all, or like at Howard. And a huge issue is that we're racially indifferent. There's racially indifference. And so, you know, you have to bring people together. You know, whether you're white, whether you're black, you have to bring people together, and you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what may come out of that. You know, there was this huge thing about, you know, whether an ally is just a term people use nowadays, right? And like trying to politically educate people on how can you turn from being an ally to a co-conspirator. So how can you go from saying, hey, yes, I do recognize your oppressions, to saying, hey, I recognize your oppression, let me roll up my sleeves and help you get something done.
Okay, so Keish, the same question, I guess, that I asked Clifton is a bit more loaded for undocumented students because there's an element of danger, right?
Yeah. So when you had posed that question, I was conflicted. Because oftentimes when we talk about free speech, it's under this notion of rights. And I push back on the notions of rights. Because for it to be recognized by the states, to be recognized into the jurisdiction of rights, that means that there's always someone some people or group of communities who are excluded. So when we talk about rights, it's always access to inclusion and not talking about people who are in the existence of inclusion, of being included into a particular set of rights and recognition. There's people who are excluded and reprimanded from that exclusion. So it's interesting because as an undocumented student and person living in the United States without state recognition, free speech wasn't something that I attached my actions to the Constitution, but it was more of necessary action. So when undocumented students are organizing and staging civil disobedience in all forms, or having public forums or having these kind of conversations, it's not necessarily attached to like rights, right? But it's survival, right? And I think for me, it was also the similar way on campus as well. It's not following certain agendas or rules, but it was more like it was necessary, right? And while I'm at a private institution, it was when things were, when I saw something that was unjust, and I didn't really think about the free speech right that I had. It was more of like an action that I had to do to survive, right, with my peers and colleagues and friends.
So one more axis of free speech is the right to assemble. And I think we like to think about things in terms of free speech or freedom of the press, but in polls, consistently, students, especially black students, say that they fear their right to protest and assemble most. So Amanda, as a person who has protested, as a person who has been involved in student activism at a majority white campus, how do you feel about that protection, that intersection of free speech and freedom of protest?
Right. I think we have to look at the historical and political context under which we have the definition of free speech, particularly in the Constitution. So when it was written, almost 300 years ago, someone who looked like me would have been enslaved and therefore had no position to even contribute to the idea of free speech. So when we say all men are created equal, we all have equal rights, we all have the right to assemble and protest, that typically doesn't apply to people of color or women or people who are marginalized. So I think in terms of that, we need to focus on, as Bill Hooks said, bringing communities from the margins to the center and making them feel as if they can actually have protection under the law to protest and to assemble.
But what about campuses that may not offer? So what about campuses where you have a private school or some sort of entity working in social media where a lot of people organize and protest now? It's a bit of a lawless land, right?
Right, and I think this is an excellent space where we can reclaim that space as people of color and people who have typically been silenced, because there is no, legal jurisdiction or history over Twitter or Facebook or social media in terms of protesting. So that can be a new space for people of color to put their new ideas out there and create a new dynamic.
So what about social media when it comes to bigotry, though? So what about when it comes to harassment or somebody who is exercising what many believe to be a right of free speech to talk down or bother people who are organizing? What happens there?
I think one of the really beautiful things about free speech in American society is the history of it to be able to generate new and innovative ideas and ways to incorporate more people. So the idea of being a racist or a homophobe or a sexist, that's old. We've been doing that for hundreds of years. So that wouldn't really be included in my definition of what is productive free speech.
Productive free speech.
Yes. So ideas that move us forward as a society rather than keeping us in the past.
Let's expand on that notion. Keish, what do you feel about the notion of productive free speech?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure the context of the use of the productivity that Amanda's using. I'm not sure about this one for me personally at this time.
Any thoughts, Clifton?
Productive free speech. Well, I want to be careful with that term because some people could think when Hitler was speaking that was productive and that was his idea of free speech, right? So I think in terms of free speech, we have to really we have to define what it is and what it means, and we have to reclaim it, right? So it's more like, if I'm going to protest and I'm going to advocate for something, and I'm going to voice my concern, I have to make sure that it doesn't marginalize another group or that it doesn't, violently affect another group. We have an election going on. in which that is going on, right? And, you know, yeah, I'm not going to say his name because I don't like using cuss words, but but a certain candidate on the GOP side, Donald Trump, is sorry, Mom, is using his idea of free speech and is violently affecting other people, but his supporters believe that is productive. So, like, how can we counteract that?
Okay. So when we're looking at, each of you is involved in activism on and off campuses. And how do the rules of engagement change when we're talking about bringing something? So you worked in Ferguson. Mm-hmm. And how do the rules of engagement change in activism between Ferguson and on Howard University campus for you?
Yeah, good question. Well, in Ferguson, you know, whenever I think about Ferguson, I'm sorry. It brings me back to a lot of things. And the thing about Ferguson is that you had young people, women, black women, queer, on those front lines getting tear gassed and organizing. And the difference when I came to Howard, a lot of people say, well, how can HBCUs get involved in this student movement going on? I'm like, well, did you not pay attention to the civil rights movement? John Lewis, Marion Barry, Diane Nash, they're from Fisk. You know, the great late
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King, right?
Morehouse.
Right, went to Morehouse. So it's more so that those students weren't so solely focused on student issues, but more so how can they get those black students on those campuses engaged in the broader struggle? How can we connect to students at PWIs and get engaged in the community? Howard was actually threatened when we stood up for Mizzou. I know many of the students and concerned students 1950. Some of them were my friends. We protested in the Ferguson. And we were threatened, and we stood our ground. We organized "This Is Our House," and you know, which was powerful, and which was historic. But it also showed that we will not be in fear of bigotry and racism, and we will fight for these ideals and this education that we believe in.
So I'm going to direct that question to Keish. How do you navigate these different spaces between off-campus activism and on?
So I struggled a lot with this question myself personally for 3 years out of my 4 years at Syracuse University, just because as an undocumented student from Georgia, where in Georgia, undocumented students are publicly banned from attending the public top 5 universities in Georgia, solely based on one's immigration status. So it doesn't matter if you're going to pay all the out-of-state tuition, you can't enter or enroll. So when education is not a right, and we don't have access to education, and attaining higher education becomes a privilege, there seems to be this disconnect between university and community. And I struggled a lot what it meant for me to be in a university setting and studying and getting access to this supposedly a socioeconomic ladder, right? And I think I'm pushing back. I think that in classrooms we have a lot of these conversations about like what capitalism means, what racism means, and in humanities courses and whatever that is. And theoretically, we're always talking about these things, but there needs to be like a connection that's made to material realities. I think that classrooms and in universities we have to recognize lived experiences as part of the knowledges that we produce and reproduce and disseminate. Because it's not disconnected. Like that disconnection can't happen. And I think Clifton was sort of talking about that in this disconnect between campus organizing and community organizing. It shouldn't be separated at all. It shouldn't be temporal, right? We're not just in the university temporarily for 4 years and organizing for student rights is actually connected. We have to understand what racial justice means and like what class struggle means. It's like it's not calling just on capitalism, but figuring out what class struggle means as a student, right? And still connected to our communities who are like low income, migrant, or folks of color. Like we have to understand what that really means and what it means to fight for with each other, right? In coalition.
Yeah.
So you recently graduated, you, Amanda, as well, and commencement season has always been a bit of a gold mine for people talking about political correctness and free speech. We had President Obama's speech at Howard, which many people have used sort of as a springboard. So how do you feel about this idea that universities, with activism, with people who may have differing viewpoints, is supposed to be a melting pot of different ideas, a competition of different ideas? I know you had some thoughts about President Obama's comments there.
Yeah, speech. It was and I greatly respect President Obama. I think he will go down as one of the greatest presidents in the history of this nation. The speech was empowering, it was powerful. But I also like to point out that there is a generational gap in this movement. Just as I think there has been in the civil rights movement and any other black liberation movement beforehand. And I think, he begins to point out, stark differences between how younger activists sort of want to engage the system and how, more seasoned activists want to engage the system. And I think what's important is that we can come to the table and we can sort of bridge this gap that exists, and we can learn from each other. I think technology has really pushed this movement far beyond we would imagine that the civil rights movement in the 60s, could have been pushed, and I think we can look at some of the things in his speech that, we could learn from, and then he could also, and many of those seasoned activists can also learn some of our tactics and listen to some of our beliefs and how we feel, we think education and what this world should look like, because I no longer think black people need to learn how to survive in this country. We need to envision a world in which we all can live in this country.
All right, I want to open up the floor for one question, maybe? Yeah, I think one.
I have a question on behalf of our Twitter audience. This is for Amanda. They'd like to know what inspired you to make your film and where they can learn more about it.
Right. So last fall, Elliot Spillers, the president, actually sent me a photo project from Mizzou students talking about what did it mean to them to be black in America. And from that point, I thought, well, what if we made a video that specifically focused on what issues that UA students faced? And from that point, I worked with a filmmaker named Patrick Maddox, who did the cinematography and the directing, and we came up with an aesthetic that we wanted to use to talk about how it felt to be a black student on campus. So you can actually go to the Huffington Post link that it was posted on, or the Vimeo link, to read more about the piece itself.
And how are people having a conversation about your video? Have you seen it?
Yes, luckily it's brought together a lot of both white and black and Latino and Asian students to really start talking about why black students are suffering physically, emotionally, psychologically, and why we're experiencing this trauma so we can move past it. So yes.
All right, well, I think we're, let's one more.
Quickly, what are the next steps for the two graduates? I'd like to know the next steps for the two graduates.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be going back to graduate school in the fall at the University of Alabama to get a master's in women's studies.
Oh, that's cool. I'm a women's universities major, so I'm also pursuing a PhD in American Studies.
Congrats.
Well, congratulations. All right, well, thank you, Amanda, Keish, and Clifton.